Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Hello and welcome to Reimagining Motion, a podcast from the High Volume Transport Applied Research Program, which is undertaking research into the complex and interrelated issues of sustainable transport across Africa and South Asia. The High Volume Transport Applied Research Program, HVT, is an £18 million investment by the UK Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office, FCDO. I'm Holger Dulkman, your host for today's session. Welcome. The transport sector is one of the greatest pollutant emitters and energy consumers globally, responsible for 24% of direct CO2 emissions from fuel combustion. Road vehicles, cars, trucks, buses, and two- and three-wheelers account for nearly three-quarters of transport CO2 emissions, most of them in high-income countries. Moreover, as the global transport sector relies on fossil fuels for 92% of its energy, it's a considerable challenge to change energy paradigms while still supporting economic growth. Such over-reliance on fossil fuels is seen as a huge challenge that will hinder the ability of countries and regions to prosper under constrained energy conditions. This is a particular issue in lower-income countries in sub-Saharan Africa, where road transport carries more than 80% of the goods and 90% of the passengers. Some countries in the Global South have started ambitious programs for decarbonization to move away from their heavy dependence on fossil fuels. And rail transport is returning to a priority position in the sector since one of the most sustainable modes of transport. Railways have the potential to reduce external costs of transport by at about half per passenger kilometers and three-quarters per ton kilometers when compared to road modes. Furthermore, rail freight produces between 75 and 85% less greenhouse gas emission per transport unit when compared to articulated trucks. In this podcast series, we're discussing the specific challenges and opportunities for road, rail, public transport, walking and cycling as we strive to develop greener infrastructure in low and middle income countries. But today I'm very delighted to talk to Professor Clive Roberts with a focus on rail. Before I get to Clive, I'd just like to introduce him. Clive is a professor of railway systems and a deputy head of the School of Engineering at the University of Birmingham. He's a director of the university's Birmingham Centre for Railways Research and Education, which has over 180 researchers. He worked extensively with the railway industry and academia in Britain and overseas. And Clive is also visiting professor at Beijing Jiao Tong University and University of Tun Hussein On in Malaysia, and will tell me in a minute or so how it will pronounce properly. So welcome, Clive. How are you doing?
Good to speak to you, Holger.
Thanks for joining us. So before we specifically consider low-income countries in sub-Saharan Africa, perhaps you could give us a brief understanding of the potential of rail to provide a greener transport future.
Yeah, so rail is really important in as decarbonising the transport sector. And particularly, obviously, as a public transport mode, it can provide a backbone for passenger movements around countries. But furthermore, in the UK, we think a lot about passenger railways, but in many places around the world, freight is really important. And therefore, railway carrying freight is really key. And railways are good in these contexts because of the steel rail provides really, really efficient movements. So we can get lots of people or lots of goods on a train, and we can get a very, very efficient mode of transportation, which enables us to go at high speed over long distances or through tunnels or through small corridors through urban areas.
Thanks, Clive. And we're highlighting the importance of freight, which is often the forgotten angle of decarbonizing transport. So let's move into considering low-income countries in sub-Saharan Africa, where your recent work is focused. To what extent is rail used at the moment? So give us a little bit of your insight about the state of rail infrastructure in sub-Saharan Africa.
So across Africa, there has been a history of particularly freight movements by rail, but many of the railways perhaps date from maybe 70, 80 years old, and some have come out of use. The other thing that's happened in Africa over time is that sort of different countries have supported African countries to develop those railway activities, and therefore there is actually a mix of standards, so different gauges, so different distances between the rails, which means that the interoperability across the continent is really challenging as well. And there isn't, as we might see in Europe, a lot of electrification of railways. I'll perhaps explain why in a moment. But that means that we see a lot of diesel rail vehicles, diesel locomotives pulling freight wagons, moving across the continent or within countries across the continent. So we've been working as part of the high volume transport program on really looking to see what's next for rail in sub-Saharan Africa. What can be done to enable and ensure that the next steps that occur, the next developments that occur are low carbon, zero carbon developments, potentially leapfrogging other technologies that we might see in other places in the world, and really just trying to understand the requirements for those particular countries. So there's some really interesting findings from our work, I think. So in Europe and many other countries around the world, the obvious route to decarbonisation is electrification, really. So in the UK, where I'm based, on our mainline railways, where we haven't got electrification, we're really pushing for electrification to occur. But there's some challenges with electrification. Electrification is expensive. In Europe, we're talking about $2 million, something like that per kilometre. India's doing it probably an awful lot cheaper than that, but there's still a real cost to electrification. And because of that cost of electrification, unless you're seeing a train, if you're standing on the side of the railway and you're seeing a train go past every 10 or 15 minutes, you're probably in the right sort of place for a business case for electrifying. If you're standing on the side of a railway and you're seeing a train every few hours, electrification isn't the right answer from the cost point of view. And then just coupled with that, in many African countries, the actual power generation capability just isn't there to provide for a railway. So Africa has some real challenges, including also actually the security of some of the infrastructure. So looking at independently powered railways is really key. And that's been the focus of our studies. What kind of future power might we put to replace the existing diesel fleets into the future that provide us a decarbonised solution going forward?
Thanks, Clive. So is it more about using the existing infrastructure, or is it more towards also building a new infrastructure? What's currently happening also in the region?
I guess it really depends. So there's been an awful lot of foreign investment in building railways in Africa. Particular countries like Kenya are building huge amounts of railways. I was in Tanzania not so long ago, and they're just about to open a big new railway line. But from a carbon point of view, that's challenging in as much as building a railway that is low carbon is challenging from an infrastructure point of view in its own right. And actually, there are quite a lot of existing railways that actually need some regeneration. So I think the solution for Africa is a mix of the two. And also, as I said, moving towards this standardized approach to allow interoperability from one country to the next. There are actually very few through country routes, which means that those freight corridors that you'd want to see and perhaps expect to see, very much the African Union really wants to get those interoperable, seamless corridors across countries aren't being developed. So some standardized approach that either uses some of the existing infrastructure or new infrastructure or a mix of the two is the solution. In terms of the rolling stock, and the primary focus of our studies recently have been on rolling stock, and we've been looking at whether what do you do with diesel locomotives? So in railways, we talk about rolling stock, which really means the locomotive and the carriages or the wagons that make up the train. And that then is really important in terms of a fundamental part of a railway system. One challenge with railways and particularly rolling stock is that if you buy a locomotive today, it probably costs, probably takes you about 5 years before you get it delivered. So if I begun to specify a locomotive today, I would perhaps hope it to be arriving somewhere 5 years later, ready to use. And then I'd probably expecting to get 40 or 45 years life out of that locomotive. So that means that if we were to start thinking about procuring something today, we'd be looking through to it retiring out of service in 2073. That's quite a long time away, particularly to be considering what diesel fuel, both availability, cost, and of course continued emissions over that time. So what we've been looking at is what are the alternative technologies for procuring rolling stock, procuring a locomotive today that would sustain into that future, and equally, what are the alternatives for actually retrofitting and changing midlife? So generally, locomotives are overhauled at midlife, about 20 years through their life. Can we actually swap out diesel engines, high-polluting diesel engines at that time, and move to something different?
So thanks also for sharing more of your insights in terms of the situation currently in sub-Saharan Africa. You mentioned several challenges, including also the issue of rolling stock and also the transition to cleaner fuels at some stage. Is there anything else in terms of like really scaling railways in sub-Saharan Africa? Are there any other challenges to overcome?
Well, the other real challenge or opportunity actually in sub-Saharan Africa is, as I say, predominantly people are making freight movements with railways at the moment, but actually the opportunity to open to passengers and actually sort of lower mass, higher value freight as well. So supplies into more remote parts of countries, medicine, those sorts of areas as well. At the moment, generally in Africa, we're talking about heavy haul freight. So moving things out of mines to ports is generally what's happening. But what else can we do to basically open up economic growth? And so there's some real opportunities there. They bring on some operational challenges about how we interrun heavy haul freight locomotives with perhaps lighter weight trains that are carrying passengers and lighter weight goods. But that's a real opportunity as well. And of course, all of this costs money, and railways aren't cheap. We know that railway technology is not a cheap solution. The operational costs are actually much lower than road if you consider the removal of the external cost. But the challenge is that initial capital cost of railway. So also part of this is how do we end up with an operational model that provides a business case for those developments over the long life of a railway?
One of the challenges also Africa is facing in general is in fact also the impact of climate change. And we know so that there are more and more extreme weather events and challenges also for building or even also maintaining infrastructure. You were as a part with the University of Birmingham, part also of an HVT policy guidance around its adaptation and transport. So what's the specific challenges also from the rail side?
Yes, so as part of the HVT program, as you say, we've been working on producing policy guidance for all modes for Africa and regions like Africa, and the issues there around how we build and construct infrastructure. Again, thinking about that life cycle for railway infrastructure, we're expecting to build things that will last us 50 years, in some cases, in cases of infrastructure, up to 100 years we're designing for. So ensuring that actually the infrastructure we specify is fit for purpose over the range of weather events and extreme weather events and just temperatures and that we may experience over that period. And generally what we find is that if we can for new build activities, if you can design those things in, then the cost differential is not that significant, and obviously it de-risks challenges later through the life cycle. The other alternative is obviously retrofitting, which does have an additional cost. And so how can we do that in a cost efficient and cost effective way? Any
solutions to your question?
Well, so I think that the key for many of these issues is really just a proper consideration, given the particular region, given the particular criticality of the transport network, etc., to fully understand what is required. There are a range of solutions that can be implemented. And it really just depends on fitting the right solutions to the right location. But there's a whole host of opportunities, we think, again, as these new transport links, and particularly railways, are being developed in countries in Africa at this very moment. We want to make sure that they are resilient into the future.
Well, we spoke earlier, you mentioned the challenge currently in terms of decarbonization, but also for the operation itself, that only about 6% are currently also like electrified, if I looked into your study also correctly. Yeah. This leads to the question, so what's next? Is it really like cleaner diesel trains, or what other options are there? And you did quite a lot of research around that. So I'd like to get also to your specific expertise here.
Yes, indeed. So electrification is a challenge in most places due to the frequency of services, due to the cost, due to the security, due to the generation capability. And so we probably are going to be, in most countries in sub-Saharan Africa, we're going to be dependent on what we'd call an independently powered unit, something like a diesel train, something where the fuel is on board for some time. And we've been really comparing cleaner diesels, and there are cleaner diesels available, and there's ways of developing diesel trains that are not so high polluting, but inherently diesel fuel gives us challenges. Comparing that with hydrogen, and we do work here at the university both on hydrogen, pure hydrogen powered units where we put hydrogen on the train, or our sort of more blue skies research is actually using ammonia trains to produce the hydrogen on the train, and also comparing with batteries. So on certain routes, particularly urban type routes, batteries have a role as well. So one of the things that we've been doing is considering a number of routes across Africa. In our studies, we focused on 4 specific routes. A route in Uganda, going from Kampala, which is just a short distance, sort of lightweight commuter train type route. A long distance freight route in Tanzania from Dar es Salaam to Kigoma, something around 1,400 kilometers in length, so a long route. A sort of medium heavy haul route in Liberia, and then a loco hauled route in Nigeria. So we looked at those four routes and looked at, well, what was the sort of technology development likely to be from a diesel point of view? How might hydrogen technology, is the technology readiness actually there? And actually is the operational readiness there, which is equally important for hydrogen? And then also thinking about whether some of those routes might be better utilized under battery. And so we initially did single studies on those 4 key lines. But then as a result of that, developed tools and sort of handbook and training to enable any railway to consider any route, so that people in local railway administrations could do these sort of initial analysis themselves and really do that optioneering early on in a project. One of the key parts I think we learn from this work in Africa, but actually work we do around the world, is really that education piece and getting people thinking about what the capabilities need to be from their railways is equally as important, or certainly the foundation step before we get on to actually thinking about the technological solution.
So you mentioned also hydrogen as a potential alternative versus solution. And my home country in Germany, read about it, like in the northern part, there's some initial quite successful, apparently, pilot project. But where is the technology? What is also your perspective when this can actually really also be taken up on a reasonable prices in Africa?
Yes, you're right. So there's a number of railways, or a handful of railways across the world that are beginning to make that transition to hydrogen. So the route in Germany that you mentioned, which is using it's a commuter route that's using an Alstom I-Linter new build train. In the UK, my university, my team, together with a company called Porterbrook, created the first UK hydrogen train. And what's interesting about the work we did is that we converted a 20-year-old train to hydrogen. So we did that midlife overhaul, and that train was demonstrated at COP26 and now is run around the network. We've also done studies here at the university to support the commuter route in California that's now operating under hydrogen as well. And there's a number of initiatives around the world. So there's work in India where people are beginning to think about this, and certainly in Africa there's some real opportunities, both in terms of our study identified this and has worked with this, but there's beginning to be a bubbling up of ideas and thinking in this space. So my feeling is that this is a solution that will come about. Hydrogen is very much suitable, and that's what our studies show, for particular types of rail routes. Coming back to the fact that in Africa we're predominantly talking about freight routes, that's the big question for us, because predominantly all of the demonstrators or early system adopters are for commuter routes, so shorter routes, lighter routes. So the question really for our study here has been, is it appropriate for the kind of routes, for example, the route we were looking, that long distance freight route we were looking at in Tanzania, could that be hydrogen powered? And the answer is yes. There's some real challenges or changes that are needed to perhaps the operational concept of how that works to make that hydrogen powered, but it's certainly possible. And what's also quite exciting, I think, around this is that hydrogen can be produced locally. So you actually change and bring into countries the opportunity to generate some fuel. So that potentially changes and enables you to create expertise in particular African countries that can be a bit more sort of hubs, and therefore claiming a little bit more of the supply chain for the new transport mode.
Are we talking here about green hydrogen or hydrogen in general?
Hydrogen in general initially, and we've done a lot of studies here looking at that hydrogen transition. Now, the nice thing about hydrogen is that if you were to procure a locomotive that was hydrogen powered and using something that is not green today, over time you could convert to something that is greener. So you're not stuck with that first capability. You potentially have something that can be procured today, because again, rolling stock comes to the end of life and you need to make a procurement decision, and that procurement decision you're stuck with for 50 years. So you can make a decision about procurement today on something that is not zero carbon or in terms of hydrogen production, but over time you can transition into a greener hydrogen production.
So you talk about perspectives, you mentioned several places where this is already also tested. So what kind of time frameworks are we talking about if that's go on scale in Africa?
There's projects around the world where people have made some of these transitions already. So the technology is available for this. And actually the political will is there for this. So these are technologies that could be rolled out now. They're ready. This isn't something that is needs an awful lot of new research to make the system work from a technological point of view. There are some sort of questions around operational concept, operational running, around training and just overall capability, that issue around the robustness of the hydrogen production in countries, those sorts of things. But fundamentally, over the sort of procurement cycle, which is around 5 years, as I've said, for new rolling stock, new locomotives, is the kind of time frame where this decision could be made. So quite short. And Also then looking at retrofitting mid-life cycle. Again, there's real opportunities there on particular rolling stock to remove diesel engines and fit hydrogen fuel cells, hydrogen storage tanks, and convert something that is a diesel polluting vehicle to something that is a hydrogen vehicle that may not be a completely green hydrogen initially, but then can transition over the next period into a greener hydrogen.
It's very interesting, Clive. Tell us a little bit more about the economics of also such a transition. And you mentioned also that there is a potential option of conversion, which I guess also might be also cheaper in terms of also investment. So what did you come up with also in your studies? Did you look into also that?
Yes, we did look in. Yeah. We did look into the cost. There is an additional cost for hydrogen conversion. It's about 1.5 times, something like that. It depends again on the project and what you're trying to do and the sizing, but it's more expensive than diesel on the first cost. Actually, for railways, the ongoing operational cost is the challenge generally in these instances. And again, it really depends on the cost of hydrogen production and the cost of oil going forward. The sort of sensible assumptions around this is that hydrogen production will get cheaper and oil will get more expensive. So the sort of balance depends on what projections you make around that. But we think there is a clear economic case for these kinds of decisions. And the other obviously point is that there's a real environmental and sustainability case for wanting to make these sorts of transitions as well. We think as I say, the technology readiness is there and the operational readiness is there, and the business case is in the right ballpark. And then that ability to transfer and create extra industry and jobs and capability around hydrogen production and create hydrogen economies in countries is also an opportunity off the back of this. So there's quite a lot of things to like about this kind of transition.
So you mentioned also it's technology feasible and there is an economic case, at least also in the medium term. What's about also the current political buy-in? You mentioned that you did also case studies with Uganda, Nigeria, Liberia. What's the response there from decision makers?
Yeah, so I think we have lots of people in all of the countries are thinking about these sorts of technologies, and they actually have a challenge in terms of financing new rolling stock, new locomotive procurement is difficult. There's an awful lot of risk potentially being taken on to proceed with diesel procurement. So there's certainly a willingness around these areas, and in some ways more so than in Europe. As I was saying, in Europe, people are thinking heavily about electrification and alternatives where those options aren't available in many of the countries that we've been looking at through the studies. So this is on the agenda as being something that is real and applicable. I think the challenges are around actually first mover type activity rather than any big blockers in this space.
Did you get any traction so far? Or are you aware of a country who wants to get started?
Yeah, so certainly in Uganda and Tanzania, there's some real interest in this space. There's also in some of in Namibia, for example, there's some real activities around hydrogen and potentially businesses there that are interested in providing other African countries with hydrogen rolling stock. So there's some real opportunities there, I think.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much also for all the information, the opportunities for railways, particularly with ways of looking into hydrogen also as part of a future decarbonization. Any final thoughts? Where will this all head and how to bring that to scale?
So I'm certain that we will see this technology. You will see this technology out in our railways over the next 5 to 10 years. In sub-Saharan Africa, there's a real sort of sweet spot in terms of the opportunity, but it actually is similar in India and other countries around the world. But in parts of the world where potentially we don't usually see huge innovation in railway activities and operations and rolling stock. So it's an exciting time for us. And we're really ready and keen to support countries in making this kind of transition.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And I hope also I will have the opportunity in the coming decade also to get on one of these trains, not just in Germany, but also in Africa. Thanks again, also Clive, and further good luck with your research and also good taking up of your findings. Thank you.
Thanks, Holger. It's been great speaking to you. Thank you.
Thank you. So thank you for listening to this episode. If you'd like to find out more about the work of our guests and any of the resources, please check out the links in the description. I also encourage you to listen to the other episodes in the series. Also, you can leave us a rating, hopefully a good one, and a review. It really helps others find our podcast. If you'd like to learn more about the work of High Volume Transport, you can check out our website at transport-links.com or follow us on Twitter at transport_links or on LinkedIn at High Volume Transport Applied Research Program. The High Volume Transport Applied Research Program, HVT, is an £18 million investment by the UK Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office, FCDO. The program's new body of research aims to help inform decisions of policymakers in low-income countries and make road and rail transport greener, safer, and more accessible and affordable. My name is Holger Dogman, and you have been listening to Reimagining Motion. Thank you. Stay and travel safe wherever you are. Goodbye and auf Wiedersehen.